Welcome to our videos on making sure your website is always up and running. In this video, we'll discuss ways to be assured your website never goes offline. In this video set, I'm going to talk you through a number of ways to help make sure your website never goes offline. Of course, whenever your site's offline, you're losing. You're losing sales, you're losing customers, you're losing subscribers, you're losing advertising views, or you're just losing potential visitors. Whatever it is that you're losing out on, that's what happens when your site is offline. If you're running an e-commerce site, it's as if your shop is shut, because of course no one can get inside to take a look around and take an order. Now, a couple of minutes of downtime here and there aren't huge impositions, and they do happen occasionally. But what you really want to avoid, of course, are hours or even longer at a time. And often, such issues are due to either web host problems or loss of data or both. And that's really what these videos are going to focus on: how to make sure your site doesn't go offline and how to ensure that you recover as quickly as possible if your site does go offline, and also how to recover almost immediately from any data loss. First of all, let's talk about web hosting. If you're a small business, you may be quite happy with a shared web hosting account. And let me talk you through one company as an example. Of course, web hosting is often quite a subjective buying decision because you often hear different reviews from different people. It's always time well spent if you aren't sure which web host to go to trying to find objective opinion. And a site where you can often get good opinions is webhostingtalk.com. It's actually a site for people who run web hosting companies, but if you do a search for a web host you might be interested placing your site with, often if you just do a search using their search functionality within their forum, then often you'll find reviews for people who have used that web hosting company. I personally use 3 different web hosting companies for different reasons, but my main company, which has been this way for several years, is Pair Networks at pair.com. Now again, because web hosting can be subjective and sometimes these service levels do deteriorate for whatever reason on occasion with all sorts of companies, then I can carefully suggest this company to you, or at least try them out or maybe look into them. But obviously, it's completely up to you who you host with. But I've been with this company for a number of years quite happily, and my most important websites are hosted with them. Okay, a basic shared hosting plan is you sharing a web server with websites belonging to other companies. First of all, what you want to look for in a web host, well, backups. If the web host does a daily backup, that's a good thing, because if there is a problem, they can restore your website from what it was a day ago, just with a day's changes, rather than with a few days or weeks' changes if the company does back up regularly. You also want to look into how quickly do they solve hardware and software problems on the server. Essentially, if there are any hardware or software problems with the server, how quickly are they taken care of? So potentially, how much more or how little time is the server offline, if at all? From time to time, web servers do need a reboot, and that may involve 2 or 3 minutes of downtime, and that's pretty much it. But that's largely unavoidable. Every computer needs to be rebooted at some point, even if it's only once every few months. So you might consider whether the web servers have more than one hard drive. Do they have 2 or more hard drives that automatically make copies across each other of their data? Generally, Pair has what they call a shadow drive, which means there's the main hard drive in the web server, and then an identical hard drive that's constantly making a copy of the data on the original hard drive. So if there's any problem with either of the hard drives, they can be replaced with no data loss. Of course, if both hard drives have a problem, then they have to revert back to the daily backup, which I believe is done on a backup tape. But it's quite rare that 2 hard drives would have a problem simultaneously. So 2 or more hard drives is an important consideration because it makes downtime from data loss a lot less likely. Also, how often or how regularly do they make sure security updates to the server operating system and the software on the server? How quickly are security updates applied? Of course, that's also very important because if security updates aren't applied, then people can potentially break into the server and steal your data or cause all sorts of problems for you. Also, another consideration is what type of operating system does the server run on, and how secure is it? Many web hosting companies use Linux servers or Apache web servers running on Linux, and Pair uses Apache running on FreeBSD. And those are operating systems with a lot of potential for security, and you want to be aware of how much security your web hosts apply. Sometimes the more security, the less functionality you have, so it's a bit of a trade-off. So some things to think about. How often do they back up? Do they have more than one hard drive per server? How often are hardware and software problems taken care of? How often are security updates applied? Really, what I'm leading to here is you want to be very aware of how hard the web host works for you to make sure you don't have security problems and you don't lose data. Obviously, you can't just depend on them. You may well want to depend on them for security issues with Apache or Linux because if you're on shared web hosting, you aren't managing the web server. They're managing it for you. And with paid hosting, you're paying for a managed service. You don't have to worry about the technical side of things. However, I do suggest that you do worry about making sure your data is secure, and that's really your concern as well as the web host. So I'll be talking about how to make data redundancy, as it's called, having multiple copies of your data. I'll be going into that in more detail in a later video. If you need more than just a shared web hosting service, then you may need a dedicated server. For example, here they offer what they offer here is managed web servers. So effectively, it's the same as a shared web server account in that you don't need to worry about managing the web server. But the difference is that you have an entire web server to yourself. You have a lot more power, flexibility, and room on the hard drive, and also more memory and so on. Again, you can choose a shadow drive option if you wish. If you pick a dedicated server and it's unmanaged, that means you have to manage the operating system, the server software, whether it's Apache or whatever it may be, and everything. So it can be a lot of work. So if you don't want to get involved in the administration of your web server, then get a managed dedicated server, or just go with shared hosting. Of course, other ways you can have redundancy if you're on a dedicated server and don't mind spending the money. Why have one server when you can have two? So that may be a consideration. And if that is something you want to consider, obviously it is quite a bit more expensive, but perhaps you can talk to your potential web host about it and how you can share traffic between web servers. Make sure how the data can be made completely up to date across all the web servers, so all the hard drives and all the servers automatically have all the same data, and how if one of the servers fails, there's no drop in service by using the other web server. So those may be considerations. As with everything, the more redundancy you have, the less chance you have of anything going wrong. So the more web servers you have, the less chance there is of something going wrong, and the more hard drives you have, the less chance there is of something going wrong, and so on. And you can, if you wish, have dedicated servers with more than one web host. Obviously, traffic can only go to one web host at a time, just because of the way DNS works. And if you aren't familiar with what DNS is, it stands for Dynamic Name Servers, and you can look it up if you wish for a more detailed description. But basically, DNS is you're telling the Internet where to send visitors for a domain. For example, Yahoo.com sets up DNS so that it points to their servers. That means that whenever someone types in Yahoo.com, they're automatically taken to Yahoo's servers. So generally, when you set up DNS, you're pointing to one web host or another web host or another web host, whichever is your preferred web host. However, if you're set up with more than one web host, you have to make sure that there are up-to-date copies of your data across all the web hosts. So if there are any problems with one web host, for example, you can change your DNS settings and it immediately moves from pointing visitors to web host X and instead starts sending them to web host Y. Now again, DNS changes don't always take effect immediately. With some domain name registrars, for moniker.com, moniker.com, GoDaddy.com, very well known, and there are a whole bunch of other registrars. Different registrars apply the DNS settings at different speeds, so you may wish to look into this. There are certain ways you can set it up with registrars if you make changes to the DNS settings and it immediately takes effect. It doesn't take hours or even days. I've just done a very quick search for DNS service and you get a whole bunch of results, one of them being part of Pair NIC. So you may wish to look into those, but basically DNS can be set up so that any changes to it take effect almost immediately. So if you do want to move away from a certain web host very quickly, and all your data is already set up with another web host, then you can just do a DNS change and traffic moves away from the first web host and starts going to the second web host. So that covers a lot of things to consider with web hosting. If you're set up with more than one web host, then you have more redundancy, more than one hard drive per web server, more redundancy, even more than one web server if you have a dedicated server or dedicated servers with a host, more redundancy. So those are all things to take into consideration, and you don't need to be technically oriented to get involved in all this. As I mentioned, there are managed dedicated servers as a service with many web hosts, so they'll take care of all the technical stuff and you don't need to worry about it. There are also services such as this one, which has been around for a few years, Rackspace.com. They essentially offer dedicated servers in an incredibly flexible way, so you can arrange with them to have almost any type of setup you wish, and many highly trafficked sites use them. However, with that flexibility comes a higher price as well. But if price isn't an issue for your web hosting, you may want to look into a solution such as this. And okay, I've been contacted by a sales assistant, so let's not worry about that. Let's move back here. So those are a number of important points to bear in mind regarding making sure your data are secure with your web host. And just to give you an idea of my setup, I have my most important sites with Pair. I have a shared hosting account, but it's a high-level shared account, and it does fine. I don't find I need a dedicated server to myself at the present time, so it's shared hosting. The web server does have more than one hard drive, which is good, but it is just with one host, of course, and on one server. But I do make regular backups, and I'll talk through all that in later videos. To date, I've been really happy with them, so I trust Pair and the service Pair offers. But obviously, if I wanted to set up even more redundancy into my website setup, I would have copies of my website set up at one or two more hosts. So then, if I wanted to, I could immediately move things over. Also, what I do is make regular backups, not to a web server, but just to a backup service. And I'll talk you through all that later. And I make backups of my databases regularly, and my email lists. I download my email lists from I use aweber.com for broadcast emails and autoresponders, so I download my email subscribers from there regularly to make sure I have a backup just on my computer. And I also have my less important sites with other web hosts, which are less expensive, but which I also find are somewhat less reliable than Pair. But again, if I really wanted redundancy in the system, I should really make copies of all the sites on all those web hosts onto other web hosts so I can make a quick and easy change if I needed to. Importantly, when making copies to other web hosts, and I'll come to this later as well, but when making copies to other web hosts, make sure everything works. If you're copying over installed scripts, for example, or password-protected folders, make sure all the settings are copied over as well, and make sure the scripts work on the new server on the new web host. Make sure your usernames and passwords work. Make sure your database is set up in a new web host so you can do an instantaneous change, because really what you want to avoid doing if possible is, if there's a problem with your old web host and you don't want to move over and spend hours or even days copying everything over and then setting everything up, because obviously during that time you're offline. That's not something I've done yet, but I should do it very shortly to help avoid any potential problems. Now, to round out this video, what you can do, of course, is just download your website onto your computer if you wish. And if it's not too large, and if you're on a broadband connection, then you can just do that without problem. And you can then re-upload it to a new website again without too much problem. So that could be one option. I actually have a huge amount of data, many gigabytes of data on my websites, because I offer quite a few downloads. So it actually takes a very long time to download and a very long time to upload. What I've simply done is used a backup service to copy all that information from my web servers to the backup services, and I'll cover all that in more detail in later videos also. So those are the main things to keep in mind when choosing a web host and putting together your web hosting setup to minimize as much as possible any downtime from your website and to help minimize any data loss as much as possible.